a time where we are just now beginning to come out of these sweeping lockdowns and social distancing we've all been trudging through, loneliness has been a rising problem for people around the world. It's been said many times, but humans are social creatures, and the cumulative stress that builds after not being able to have meaningful interactions with other people face to face for extended periods of time takes a toll on everyone, whether they realize it or not. During these times, many have sought social interaction via the internet, engaging with online communities that for a fair number of people become veritable support groups for those struggling with real-life problems that can only be escaped by immersing oneself into the sea of online interaction. However, while I do believe in the positive aspects of online socializing, I'd be a hypocrite if I didn't, seeing as I've barely left my house for the past year or so and have just started to remember what sunshine feels like again. Throwing oneself completely into the world of virtual human connections can result in some less than pleasant outcomes. For some people, the online world becomes more real and important to them than anything that might exist in the real world. Online, if you search hard enough, you can find like-minded people who will accept you, interact with you. They may even seem to genuinely care about you as a person. And if someone doesn't have a strong enough anchor tethering them to the quote-unquote real world, the online world can slowly engulf a person. Let it go on for too long, and one may begin to substitute the real world for their own artificial one they've discovered, at the expense of those around them and themselves. But why am I talking about the internet in regards to a movie set in 1990 about a man watching a videotape on a CRT TV? Well, let's find out.
We're gonna get to know each other. We're gonna talk about whatever you want, but more than anything, we're gonna have some fun. And hopefully, it's the start of a beautiful relationship. What do you say?
Sounds fucking weird, Andy.
Brought to us from director John Stevenson as his first feature debut, Rent-A-Pal tells the story of David, a 40-year-old man who has been living with his mother Lucille for the past 10 years, acting as a caretaker for her as she slowly recedes into late-stage dementia. Meanwhile, he's also been using a company called Video Rendezvous, a video dating service that matches singles together by recording messages for each other on videotape. You know, this kind of thing.
Hi, I'm Maurice. I'm an executive by day and a wild man by night.
Perhaps unsurprisingly, he hasn't gotten any matches so far, and decides to record a new tape to hopefully reinvigorate his appeal. While he's at the studio, he chances upon a videotape in their bargain bin, Rent-A-Pal. The tape contains a recording of a man named Andy, who says he wants to build a genuine connection with whoever is viewing the tape. Although the tape is nothing more than a recording, Andy injects pauses and reactions into his speech in such a way that is meant to simulate a real conversation. At first, David is understandably skeptical, and initially dismisses the tape as just that, a dumb tape. But after finding out that he just barely missed out on a dating match with someone who, on paper, seemed literally tailor-made for him, he begins to spiral deeper into despair, and this is where Andy comes in. Depressed and dejected, David begins to watch the tape again, likely just for lack of a better idea in the current moment. However, a random line of the tape seemingly matches up perfectly with how David is feeling at the moment. Even though he is nothing more than a recording saying pre-recorded words with a specific timing, Andy ends up being exactly who David needed in that moment. In that moment, Andy was more of a friend to David than anyone else in his life. From here, the film continues to build on the relationship between Andy and David, and you see something interesting start to happen. At first, David seemed almost unsure how to respond to Andy, and the jarring interjections Andy makes to simulate a conversation at first serve more to shatter the suspension of disbelief that he is talking to a real person. However, as David begins watching the tape more and more, he starts to adapt to Andy's pauses and interjections, becoming comfortable enough that the more he converses with Andy, the less it seems like he's speaking to a videotape and more to an actual person. As the film goes on, hanging out with Andy becomes a regular part of David's routine. They talk, get drunk, and even play Go Fish together. The awkward pauses and interruptions become less and less frequent as David learns to navigate them, fully immersing himself into the fantasy of speaking to another person. In a strange way, just as Andy was the right person for David, David is slowly transforming himself into the right person for Andy. And after a while, were it not for the grainy picture on the clearly ancient CRT TV, You could potentially mistake this for a FaceTime or a Zoom call between friends. But it's not. It's just one lonely man in his mother's basement, talking to a videotape. Now, it's here that I want to make something clear, and I already put up a spoiler warning, so if you don't want spoilers, why are you even here, idiot? Rent-A-Pal is not a cursed videotape, or at least I think the film would tremendously suffer in quality if John Stevenson had leaned more heavily into this interpretation. The film is admittedly ambiguous enough that you can interpret it however you wish, but I think simply chalking it up to a haunted tape would rob the film of its much more powerful message. To me, this is not a story about someone being haunted. Andy is not a mastermind who is manipulating or indoctrinating David throughout the film, and none of the events that come to pass are at all a pre-planned conclusion to some master plan concocted by Andy. What we have here is a person who came into contact with a catalyst that sparked a reaction among the cocktail of loneliness and anger that's been building within David for potentially years now. To me, this film has more value not as a horror movie, but as a character study. Which I guess would be a good time to talk about the characters, huh?
Frank is dead! Do you fucking hear me? He has been dead for a long time! He killed himself! Don't you fucking remember, stupid?
Now, as stated earlier, David has been taking care of his mother Lucille for the past 10 years on account of her worsening dementia. However, what I didn't mention was that this only came about after his father, Frank, committed suicide 10 years prior. Since his mother requires round-the-clock care and her social security covers just about all of their essentials, David doesn't really leave the house for much of anything besides groceries. He doesn't have any friends, and he's only been using the video dating service for a few months now, with no results to show for it currently. Even his only other habitual human contact, his mother, has become more of a stranger to him as the years wear on, often referring to him by his father's name if she's mentally lucid enough to remember a name at all. And you can see the stress of their relationship slowly eating away at David. This eventually reaches a breaking point when Lucille catches David masturbating and calls him by his father's name. This causes David to lose his composure as he screams at Lucille that Frank is dead and has been for years. Also, a quick side note, I feel like this scene would be hard to watch regardless, but the performances from the actors playing David and Lucille make this absolutely gut-wrenching. In fact, the actors in general are a huge part of the appeal of this film. While the story has an interesting premise on paper, a not insignificant part of it is merely watching a man watch a videotape. Had David not been portrayed so convincingly as a socially stunted introvert, or if Andy had been even a bit less charismatic and charming, this film would have been nowhere near as enjoyable. A film such as this lives and dies by its performances, and every actor present absolutely nailed it. To return to the scene we were discussing, however, even though afterward David becomes filled with guilt to the point that he lies to his mother, reassuring her that Frank isn't actually dead because she likely won't remember either way in a few hours, this outburst is arguably the most genuine show of emotion we've seen from him thus far. Even while watching the tape of Lisa, the dating match he missed out on, you can see him physically see him. Holy shit, Donnie, edit your fucking script. Even while watching the tape of Lisa, the dating match he missed out on, you can physically see him trying to hold himself together. And it's not difficult to determine where all this pent-up frustration is coming from. During one of his conversations with Andy, David reveals that in the past, Lucille had been physically abusive to him. He also tells a story of how he was bullied horrendously as a child and ended up getting falsely suspended from school at one point because other kids were sending cruel notes to a girl he liked, pretending to be him. The girl apparently knew that the notes weren't from David, but she never said a word to anyone, and David took the blame. David, as he is currently, is a product of his past trauma. He clearly harbors at least a small bit of resentment toward his mother, both for her physical abuse and potentially for feeling like she has trapped him in this situation. Yet at the same time, he is so mistrustful of the world at large that having to take care of his mother seems like the perfect excuse to hide himself away and never risk facing a situation as painful as that ever again. And then along comes Andy, someone who not only seems to sympathize with David's plight, but also draws comparison to a similar situation he experienced while in high school. From David's perspective, Andy is the only person to have ever gotten him, so to speak. The only person who seems like he understands and relates to David's experiences. This videotape of a man talking to a camera is the closest thing to a friend David has had in nearly 10 years. And yet, despite his despair, David is still searching for a genuine human connection, which is why when he receives a message from the dating agency that his previously missed match, Lisa, is currently available and wants to meet him, he does end up going on a date with her. Now, Lisa is a character who has received some criticism for being too good to be true. She's a fan of jazz, and what do you know, David's dad was a professional jazz musician. She's also a professional caregiver and seems uniquely positioned to empathize with David's predicament of having to put his life on hold in order to care for his mother. And while I can understand the criticism of her character, I also feel as if that's missing the point, which I'll explain fully in a minute, so just bear with me. Lisa is more than just a girl who happens to be a good match for David, but the full realization of this doesn't really come until David returns home, pops in the Rent-A-Pal tape, and eagerly tells Andy all about his date. But rather than being happy for David, Andy is almost immediately bitter and jealous, wildly accusing David of taking their friendship for granted and claiming that Lisa is trying to come between them. And what's interesting about this scene to me is I don't actually think it's real. In their previous interactions, Andy's responses were generic enough that there's a fair bit of wiggle room for a viewer to fill in the gaps with their own personality and interpretation of his responses. But in this scene, Andy is incredibly specific, directly calling out David for forgetting plans they apparently made to play cards later. The only other explanations for this sudden rise in specificity would be either that the tape is haunted and is now directly speaking to David, or that Andy specifically recorded lines in the eventuality that someone would blow off watching the tape to go on a date. Now, neither of these makes sense to me, both logically and in the context of the themes the film has been exploring thus far. So I can only imagine that this conversation is just a figment of David's imagination, nothing more than David's internal monologue manifested through this character being portrayed on a videotape. Lisa represents everything David has been yearning for and thus far missed out on in life: a real connection to the outside world and a chance at genuine human companionship. But to David, Andy was what saved him from the depths of despair. Andy was there for him when no one else was. Lisa may be the healthier option for him in the long run, but Lisa is also a risk, an unknown. David is torn between a chance at true, genuine happiness and the closest thing to a friend he's had in quite some time. Andy will never ask him to change. Andy will never ask him to grow and learn as a person. In fact, doing so would mean that David would eventually, to some extent, outgrow Andy. I sort of talked about this a bit in the intro, but I can't help but draw parallels to a number of toxic online communities that perform a similar function that Andy does. A safe place where people can commiserate and feel like they are surrounded by people who truly understand and accept them. And that's not to say that I think most or even a large number of online communities are toxic by default. During quarantine, I too found myself getting more immersed in a number of fandoms and online discussion boards simply because it does help ease the feeling of loneliness I think a lot of people have been suffering under the last year or so. But that's not to say that there aren't a number of communities that exist to foster a defeatist, isolationist mindset. There's a very specific community on Reddit that came to mind while I was watching this movie that I'm not going to name because I really don't want to give it more traffic than it already has, that centers around spreading wildly unfounded and sometimes dangerous conspiracy theories regarding COVID-19 and the vaccine. It actively encourages users to cut off friends and family who are not amused by this shit and pushes people to isolate themselves from both their immediate support networks and, in some cases, reality itself. And anyone who expresses even the slightest iota of dissent or questions the conclusions already made by the community as a whole is labeled as a shill or a traitor. And to an extent, I can see how this kind of mindset and community can be comforting in a weird sort of way. Everyone out there doesn't really care about you or how you feel.
But here, We understand you. We'll never tell you you're wrong. Here, you can be safe. All you have to do is promise to never change, never think, never grow. Like a recording on a videotape, you must be the same forever. If you can do that, then you'll never be alone again.
We're going to get to know each other. We're going to talk about whatever you want. But more than anything, we're going to have some fun. And hopefully, it's the start of a beautiful relationship. What do you say?
Sounds fucking weird, Andy.
Now, much like passing a kidney stone, most stories can really only be fully understood and analyzed once they've ended. And the ending of Rent-A-Pal takes a bit of a weird turn. To quickly summarize the last few minutes of the film, David stumbles upon his mother cutting up the videotape of Andy, mistaking it for masking tape. In a rage, David strikes her across the face and leaves her writhing on the floor as he travels to the studio to obtain another copy of Rent-A-Pal. When he returns home, he takes Lucille to the top of the stairs, cruelly whispering to her that she is the reason his father committed suicide, and pushes her down the stairs. Lisa arrives shortly after, struggling to understand what David has done, as David begins to mimic the speech and cadence of Andy from the videotape. As he attempts to murder her to prevent her from calling the police, Lisa manages to stab David in the chest with a pair of scissors before fleeing for help. David, quickly losing blood and nearing death, drags himself downstairs, turns on the videotape, and fast forwards to the end, with Andy giving one final heartfelt goodbye as David bleeds out alone in front of the TV.
There's a lot to unpack here.
Now, I understand it is the height of hubris to try and tell a creator that they ended their story wrong, so I'm not going to do that. However, I cannot help but wonder if the themes of loneliness and isolation that are so well represented in the film might have benefited from less of an in-your-face slasher-style ending that so many other horror movies have relied upon to brute force an emotional reaction from the audience. I said before that I personally don't subscribe to the interpretation that Rent-A-Pal is actually a cursed videotape. However, given how batshit insane the final minutes of the movie are, it is really hard to have an airtight argument against at least some part of this story being supernatural to some extent. And to his credit, John Stevenson doesn't fully invite this conclusion for the audience, but he absolutely leaves the door open, and I think the film as a whole slightly suffers for it. And now that is not to say that the ending wasn't enjoyable on some visceral emotional level for me, but I just don't think this film needed to have a slasher-type ending for the subject matter it was trying to tackle. Stevenson has confirmed in interviews that this film's themes were absolutely influenced by the nature of social media and the effect it had on people during the height of the COVID quarantine. And I won't deny that there are dozens of examples of people who have been radicalized by online communities to commit acts of horrific violence. But these are extreme examples of the effects of social isolation and radicalization. It's more often that the damage done by these things is much more subtle and creeping. People usually don't jump to fucking murdering their families just because some people online told them it would be a swell idea. When people become radicalized by online communities, the negative effects are oftentimes much more mundane than a random outburst of violence. More often, they may become distant, less open to others, perhaps using jargon or lingo that people outside of their communities find impossible to understand. Slowly, they push their friends and family away, or they themselves are tacitly avoided as people around them become less and less able to relate to the person they've transformed themselves into to better fit into the community they've chosen online. As far as delivering on the tension built up between David and his mother throughout the movie, I could see the more violent conclusion being justifiable as a thematically appropriate ending, but for the story of loneliness and isolation that had up to this point been so painstakingly crafted, I think the sudden outburst of violence at the end somewhat undermines what the film has been about up until now. Although I guess in the end, what it comes down to is a difference in opinion regarding how different people view the negative effects of loneliness and isolation. Given the ending of Rent-A-Pal, it seems to me that John Stevenson views the effects of loneliness more as a ticking time bomb, waiting to inevitably go off. And I guess I view it more as a cancer, slowly eating away at you until there's nothing left. And when the end does come, it's not as comfortingly final as a pair of scissors through the chest. To me, loneliness is slower, insidious, and when the end finally comes, there's a chance you've already been dead for quite some time. Nothing more than a shambling husk, constantly reassured by the cacophony of voices masquerading as a friend that you've never been more alive.